thank you very much. This is obviously a phenomenal place. I want to thank Adam and everybody at Superofficial, the Copper Easel for hosting me, the PSL for being here. It's great. I really think you're going to enjoy today's presentation. If this is your first time coming to the People's Classroom, it's working class perspectives of history and trying to unpack unknown pieces of history to help you better understand and grapple with the present ultimately. So obviously we're going to go through LGBTQ plus rights today. I'll put this back up at the end, but if you are interested at all in following, any social media feeds or anything along those lines, I have QR codes and whatnot that you can join to stay up to date with what we do here. So I'll put that back up afterwards. But for today, this is how I'm going to kind of break it down. Just go over, what the People's Classroom is all about. Go through the history of the LGBTQ plus movement. Then we'll take a little bit of a break, and then I want to connect the dots back to today, because that's one of the biggest things that I try to do here is history does not happen in a bubble. Like the things that happened in the past have a direct correlation to things that are happening today. So we'll get into some modern issues, and then we'll open it up for any Q&A or discussion. The pamphlets, the handouts that are on your I almost said desks, so I'm still in school mode, and your seats, is you can take notes if you have anything that you'd like to ask throughout the course of the presentation. Jot it down. We can get to it at the end. And then I have a few discussion questions that I'm really curious to hear everybody's thoughts on ultimately at the end. So to give you a quick overview of kind of my overall goals for the People Classroom, and then I'll get to some more specifics. It's really this, like if you take a second and read through this quote, if studying history always makes you feel proud and happy, you probably aren't studying history. If you really think about it, like for myself as a history teacher, what do you think my job is? What should I probably be doing with a group like this inside of my classroom? What should I be showing? The truth, okay? And is the truth sometimes difficult? Yeah, but you have to grapple with it, otherwise you can't act in the present. So that's one of my overall goals. The other one of my favorite people in history, Malcolm X. Okay, if you take a second and read through his quote up there at the top, I hope everybody can actually read it. I guess, what is he arguing after you go through this? That's it. Okay, so perfect. All right, so to begin with, before I get into my presentation, I want to give you a couple opening prompts that you can discuss this with other people real quick. If you want to just jot down your thoughts, that'd be great as well. But if you open up the packet, there's a couple opening writing prompts that I have that I really want to hear your thoughts on to kind of put you in the right frame of mind for the things that I'm going to go through throughout the course of the presentation. So I'm going to start with this quote from a civil rights icon, not as super well known as some of the others, but Fannie Lou Hamer. She has this quote up here. So nobody's free until everybody's free. So if you can take a second, jot down some thoughts, or at least just discuss it with somebody around you real quick. Like, is this quote correct in your eyes? And how do you think it's going to relate to our discussion, my presentation for today? All right, so just take like 30 seconds if you want. Jot down your initial thoughts, or you can talk about it with somebody else, and then we'll come back together as a group. But think about what this quote means. Is it accurate? How do you think it relates to what we're going to talk about? All right, would anybody like to offer up their thoughts? Is this quote correct? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it is. There's fewer people free today than much yesterday.
Definitely, yeah. Sadly, I think that's true. And I'll highlight some of those examples for sure. How do you think this relates to what we're going to be talking about? Which group of people is definitely a very oppressed group of people that need their liberation, that need their freedom? Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to take a deep dive into that. And that's the biggest thing that I want to stress with you is the importance of solidarity with the oppressed. Okay, when we all work together to definitely free a group of oppressed people, everybody benefits ultimately at the end of the day. The second prompt, and this is really the more big picture connection that I'd like to make. Take a look at the political cartoon that I have on the next page. And if you can give me examples of this would be even better. But why does capitalism, why does it require scapegoats? all throughout history, why do you see that connection? So use the cartoon, if you need a little bit of help with that. But take a second, see if you can jot down the answer to that question and any specific examples. Okay, so why does capitalism, all throughout the history of this economic mode of production, why does it need scapegoats? Okay, so take a second, jot down some thoughts. Forgot to bring enough writing utensils for everyone, so try. Wow. All right, let's start with the tougher question first. So, why does capitalism require scapegoats? Why do you see that all throughout history? A group of people being selected and
You need a cheap source of labor.
definitely need a cheap source of labor. That's a great answer.
I think it's also because the ownership class is so small that if they don't break up the chief source of labor, then it's obviously power.
I'm sure everybody's familiar with the term divide and conquer. And that's the whole point of the rich, is divide and conquer the working class. And you can break people up into these different segments. They're much easier to control ultimately.
Well, the biggest reason too is you need to hide what's actually going on. You do that by using scapegoats.
Excellent, very good. And if you look at this, I hope everybody can see this up here, but what is the root cause? All these issues that we're dealing with in the present, what is the thing that ties them all together? What is the root cause of these monumental issues? When you look across the United States, but honestly the world at large, what is the connecting thread there? It's all capitalism. That's what it comes back to. That's the root of the power of all these awful things that we're seeing inside of the United States and throughout the world. Because like you mentioned, if you ever look at like a pyramid of how capitalism operates, this is basically the breakdown. The people at the top have to divide up everyone else. Even though the working class is the one that supports the whole system, if you can divide people up, you can better manage them, you can better distract them, you can better take advantage of them, you can better exploit them, ultimately at the end of the day. So, can you give me a few examples of groups that are definitely been scapegoated throughout history, and honestly still today? Nothing's really changed, unfortunately. But what are some groups that are always targeted by the capitalist class, made to be scapegoats, divide and conquer, all that stuff? There's tons of examples, sadly.
Black males.
Absolutely. So you can look at African Americans throughout history. I'll give you an example of that in a second. Absolutely. Immigrants, very good. So you look at immigrants throughout history. Way back when immigration was first opened up in the United States, they were always blamed for issues. It's no different today. Okay, it's the exact same thing. And obviously we're seeing what's taking place with ICE and some of these horrific events that are happening across the country. African Americans was also mentioned. Here's a super racist cartoon from the Reconstruction era in United States history, but when African Americans got their emancipation, when they were finally freed, look very closely at this cartoon. What was the argument here by the white working class, or by white people in general? What did they think was going to happen once enslaved people were freed? You're going to have to work now. God forbid. Okay, so that. And then if you flash forward to today, like when the Black Lives Matter movement was really at its height, you saw a lot of people focused on, oh, the looting. You know, all these African Americans are out looting and doing that sort of stuff. It's a distraction, okay? And then obviously, like, women have also been scapegoated throughout history. This is an anti-suffrage cartoon back in the 1910s. Look closely at this. If a woman gets the right to vote, what's going to happen? I don't know. Yeah, you're going to have to actually be a dad. God forbid, you know, that you do that. And and then if you flash forward to today, though, are women still like targeted and scapegoated? For sure. And unfortunately, with like the dawn of incel culture, you're seeing prime examples of that, unfortunately, taking place today. But then the groups that we're going to specifically focus on, when you look at the LGBTQ plus community, obviously trans people are being specifically targeted today. When you look at a cartoon like this, I mean, the hypocrisy is off the charts. But even beyond just this, have you guys noticed that, like, lately, anytime there's a shooting that takes place, who's always the go-to of who actually might have committed this mass shooting inside of the country? Right. Here's some stats to push back against that. Look very closely at mass shootings from 2018 all the way up to 2023. Who seems to be the major culprit of the mass shootings inside of this country? Is it trans people or cisgendered people? Not even close. That's it, exactly. So, that's a huge issue. So you look at, this cartoon's kind of dark when you really think about it, but hey, at least we're protecting the kids from what? Right. So, it's absurd, but just to really drive the point home, who are you doing the bidding of if you scapegoat an oppressed group of people? Who are you playing directly into the hands of? The 1%, the rich. Okay, you are doing their job for them, ultimately. So that's why I love this cartoon. I think it really gets to the main message that I'm trying to drive home up here. But the king, what does he need to do here? Turn them against each other. Then what doesn't happen to him? He doesn't get overthrown. It's as simple as that. Another excellent cartoon, but it pretty much says the exact same thing. Every worker for himself, what is their life like? Horrible. It's pure hell. When they get organized, what happens? More power. You put pressure on the boss. Okay. Here's another. You're going to see Malcolm X a couple times throughout this, so buckle up now, I guess. This is just a great example of what I'm talking about. I think he puts it in really eloquent terms. Like you slap someone with an open hand, what's it like? Yeah, it's less force. You put that hand together and you hit someone, then what? It's significant, okay? It makes an actual statement. So always remember that. Punch up, don't punch down, okay? Because like I said, you're doing the bidding of the upper class if you do that. So let's get to some actual history up here. So we're going to take a look at, this is such a vast topic. I'm going to really try to focus it on the 1920s all the way through to today, because otherwise it's going to take me 7 different sessions to actually get through the entire history. So I try to focus it as best I can. We'll start with this. Just look very briefly at the history of queerness. I want to show you a quote. Is anybody familiar with this legendary sexual researcher Alfred Kinsey and his studies? Yes. So read Kinsey's quote up here. What argument is he making?
It's a natural expression.
Has queerness always been there in human history? Yes. Okay. So you go back to the ancient Egyptians. There's example of queerness in those societies and civilizations. Go back to the Greeks and the Romans. There's tons of examples of that. And then for our purposes, for my discussion, we're going to go through the industrialization time period all the way up through today. All these different examples. Now, again, for our purposes here, it was during the industrialization time period that queer people finally started to build communities together, and they started to match up with each other in significant ways and realized there was other people like them out there. How do you think the United States and other Western governments responded during this time period, though, when queer people started to get together, started to organize? How do you think the Western governments responded? Yes. Okay, and here's a ton of really major anti-LGBTQ plus laws, some legislation that was passed. The first thing that you notice, and this dates all the way back to the colonial time period in U.S. history, sodomy was considered a crime with what sort of penalty in many cases? Usually a death penalty. Okay, then for number 2, homosexuality was considered a mental illness by the APA's DSM. Okay, and they came with involuntary placement in some horrific mental institutions and being forced to go through conversion therapy and these horrific treatments that took place inside of those areas. Then I'm not sure people are familiar with number 3, but the Comstock laws were passed, which was basically government censorship of any sort of material, literature, anything that the federal government deemed as obscene could be wiped away, and you could face significant penalties for maintaining that material or distributing it. So that's how they kind of shut these groups down, was these various laws that were up here. Does anybody want to take a guess? When was sodomy officially made as not a crime anymore inside of the United States? I'm talking all 50 states. Do you know when they finally did away with these sodomy laws?
2000s.
Yeah. It's 2012. Okay. So yeah, you look through that. It wasn't even until 1962. You guys, hopefully, this is your little geography test up here. You know which state was the first to decriminalize sodomy? Illinois. Okay, so Illinois was the first, and that took until the 1960s to actually be put on the books. And sadly, there are still technically sodomy laws on the books in the states that you see up here. They just don't enforce it, but they still have it as their official codes of law. So it's still there, which is kind of terrifying to actually think about. The other stuff that I mentioned, though, some of those mental institutions, if you know history at all, you'll get the comparison that this newspaper headline is making, but Atascadero was in California. It was one of these horrific mental institutions. Do you see what they're claiming that place was like? Dachau was what? A concentration camp in Nazi Germany. So that's like how people were treated inside of these places, just going through pure hell. And then conversion therapy, was also forced upon these people to make their lives even worse. Then the Comstock laws, like I mentioned, there was a New York version of it, but I'll move on. Now, in comparison, do you know how, and this is the 1920s now, do you know how the Soviet Union and communist societies dealt with queerness during the exact same time period? The Soviet Union in particular.
Well, at first there was openness, but that disappeared pretty quickly.
Yeah, so I'm going to focus on the early time period for them. So in 1917, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks, had their successful communist revolution, one of the first things that they did, they decriminalized homosexuality, which was revolutionary for the time period. And it was on purpose. I want you to read the quotes up here from the Soviet Commissar of Health. His name was Nikolai Shemeshko. But read his quotes. Why did they do this, I guess is what I'm asking. That's it. Okay, that was the main goal of their revolution, was to actually include everyone. And I guess the bigger point that I'm trying to make, if a 1920s Soviet peasant could understand, coming out of like Tsarist Russia and like illiteracy time period, they could understand that nobody is free until everyone is free. Does anybody in the United States in 2025 have any sort of excuse?
None whatsoever.
Yes. Okay, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. Like, people were way ahead of the game back then. So people today, if you're still, closed-minded when it comes to that stuff, that says a lot about you at the end of the day. So, all right, let's get to some examples of U.S. history. This was a short-lived group, but this is one of the very first LGBTQ plus human rights groups, and they were called the Society for Human Rights. They first popped up in Illinois. Okay, so that's where this organization began. And the guy who started it is the guy over there on the left. His name was Henry Gerber. He was a German immigrant. And he actually learned a lot from Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a citizen of Germany. And he was the guy that started like the very first Institute for Sexual Research and provided a safe space for queer people, trans people, etc. It was really revolutionary, some of the studies that he was starting up inside of Germany. Now, you can probably connect the dots on this. What do you think happened to Hirschfeld eventually inside of Germany for, funding studies like this?
All his books were written.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, which group do you think was at the forefront of that? The Nazis. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, one of their very first mass book burnings was of all the literature from Hirschfeld's institute, and they burned down the actual institute itself. Okay, so they just torched the place. They did not like, obviously, what he was doing there. And this picture that you see of them giving the Hitler Heil and whatnot, that's them burning that literature from Hirschfeld's institute. So that's one of the first Nazi book burnings. Hirschfeld himself, he had to flee. He was exiled, and then he died just 2 years later inside of France in 1935. So Henry Gerber kind of learned from him and tried to start his own version of that inside of the United States. Gerber went through hell setting that all up. He got placed in an involuntary mental institution in 1917, had a really tough time. But once he emerged out of that, he started the Society for Human Rights, and he actually got a charter from the Illinois government. Take a guess, though, how could a gay rights group in the 1920s in the U.S., how could they get an official charter to be officially recognized by the U.S. government and the Illinois state government in this case?
Given the fact that they were homosexual.
Guess what he didn't mention when he pitched this to the Illinois government?
Yeah.
The being gay at all. He just kept that under the radar, and they just gave him a charter because they're like, oh, I guess, oh, sure, why not? So that's how he did it. But one of the impressive things about their group, it was only a group of 11 people, so it was a very small organization. But Gerber named as his president an African-American clergyman named John T. Graves. So why do you think I want to highlight that? What does it demonstrate about Gerber and this early gay rights group? inclusivity and solidarity. Okay, so they were pretty impressive, very ahead of their times. And they had a pretty simple platform. So these are their 3 ways to try to get emancipation, liberation, at least some semblance of gaining some of their rights. It was just by engaging in a series of lectures, publishing literature that would educate people, and then working with legal authorities to try to get rid of the involuntary mental institutions and that sort of stuff. Obviously, and sadly, what do you think happened to this group pretty early on, especially when they started to get onto the public and preach these sorts of things? Harassed, ad nauseum. Those Comstock laws kicked in, and when they published their literature and put it out to the public, Gerber himself got arrested for distributing this obscene material in the eyes of the federal government. The Chicago PD harassed them to the nth degree and ultimately had mass book burnings themselves for them and shut their institute down. So the point that I'm trying to make is this. What does it say about the US government that the KKK were running roughshod during the 1920s and are honestly still around today, but a gay rights group couldn't even last a year? What insight does that provide you? That's it. Okay, that really gets to the fundamentals of it. It shows you where America's priorities are, where that group is still able to run around like crazy. Gerber was arrested. He was placed on trial 3 different times for violating the Comstock laws. He lost his life savings. He basically became destitute by the end of his life, so the US government destroyed him. Again, for preaching something pretty basic, you would think. Thankfully, he's at least remembered now. He does actually have a monument outside of the place where the Society for Human Rights was first developed, so that's nice. This is tougher. Do you know which group of people in Chicago, when he was going through these trials and the federal government was persecuting him, and these trials were very costly, they're very expensive, do you know who he asked for support and financial assistance from in fighting these Comstock charges?
Black churches.
No, good guess. It's a tough one.
Communist Party.
No, good guess.
Jewish synagogue.
Nope. You want me to just tell you? All right. All right. He asked for help from wealthy gays inside of Chicago. Okay. How do you think the upper class gay people responded to his requests? They did not. Okay. Why do you think they decided, we don't want to get involved in this? They're part of the ruling class. That's, you got it.
You still see it today?
No doubt, and that's great examples I'm going to show you to connect it to today. It'd be like if you asked Tim Cook, who is gay, for help. Okay, at the end of the day, he probably isn't going to help you out because what class is he a part of? The rich. He's part of the 1%. So I guess the point of why I wanted to highlight Gerber's struggle in particular, what's the lesson to take away from what happened to Gerber and the Society for Human Rights?
Things haven't changed.
Not much.
There was that quote I heard the other day that history has repeated itself at rhymes.
It's excellent, yes. Totally agree. See how this quote connects. What usually needs to happen to grind the wheels of history for change to actually take place? Doesn't matter what time period you're talking about. Mass movements, working class movements. You have to align with other oppressed groups in order to do that. Gerber trying to appeal to the wealthy didn't really ultimately end up working out for him. So I guess the bigger picture thing that I want to focus on to tie it directly to today is everybody, I hope, familiar with the term rainbow capitalism? Okay? I want to go through the dangers of relying on rainbow capitalism or relying on the bourgeoisie to ultimately try to liberate you. And I'll give you a couple examples. Does anybody remember a couple years ago when Target put up these pride signs inside of their stores?
They did not have that this year.
What's up?
They didn't have that this
They
year.
did not have that this year, and there's a specific reason for it. How did some people react to something as innocuous as this? Psychopathic, insane outrage over this, and that's why today you don't see that stuff inside of a Target store anymore. Because what is Target really trying to do here? They're trying to make money off of it. And once they realize, we can't profit off of this, what will they do? Forget about it. Okay, do they actually believe in solidarity with the LGBTQ population? Hell no. Okay, so that's what they were actually after, and they faced backlash. And even the Target Pride, the person who designed some of those symbols realized, they basically sold me out here, threw me to the wolves. Another example, Is everyone familiar with Dylan Mulvaney?
Yeah.
Dylan Mulvaney did a very minor advertisement for Bud Light. What happened in response to this? They went nuts. Okay, and sadly, is everybody familiar with Kid Rock? Yes. How did Kid Rock respond to Dylan Mulvaney being on one? And by the way, and you said this to me, this can was only sent to Dylan Mulvaney. It wasn't even mass produced or anything. People thought, oh my God, there's going to be a trans person on my Bud Light. I can't handle that. Do you know what Kid Rock did in response to this? He took a video of himself annihilating a bunch of cans of Bud Light with his automatic rifle. Okay? And now today, what do Bud Light ads look like? I don't know if anybody saw the Super Bowl ad, but it's like, straight white dudes hanging out, drinking beer, and that's it. And you know who's rumored to be the new spokesperson for Bud Light moving forward? Makes total sense. I'll just tell you for the sake of time. Sydney Sweeney. Okay? Do you get what Bud Light's trying to do here? Perfect. Another example. Remember when the M&Ms all of a sudden became gay? Okay. She's like that. All right. Meanwhile, do you guys know which company owns M&Ms? Mars. Do you know what Mars does in like other nations around the world to acquire the ingredients that are necessary for it? Yeah, they use like child slaves to actually acquire the cocoa that they need to make their chocolate products. So what is Mars really trying to do here? Why come up with an advertisement campaign like this? That's it, okay? So I cannot stress this enough. I would like you to read this entire quote. This is very important to get to the point that I'm trying to make to really drive the point home. So take a second and read through that. If you can just sum this up, what will the rich always do when push comes to shove? They will protect their own class interests. Okay, so I'll give you a fictional version of this. Everybody familiar with the movie Knives Out? Okay, if you're not familiar with Knives Out, basically there's a rich patriarch. He's the guy in the chair right there. He ends up passing away, and has a massive inheritance, and he ultimately is going to give the inheritance to his housekeeper. Okay. Do you want to take a guess who the rest or most of the rest of these people are behind him? So the housekeeper's over here on the right. Who do you think everybody else is for the most part? His family members, okay? So throughout the course of the film, basically there's different versions, which is basically like different versions of people on the political spectrum. Some of them initially are like super nice to the housekeeper, and they really seem like an ally of hers. They seem to be on board. Once they find out that that inheritance is not going to go to them and is going to go to the poor housekeeper instead, how do you think their attitude changes throughout the course of the film? What do you see? They band together. They're going to protect their class interests at the end of the day. I'll give you a real-life example of this. Is everyone familiar? I'll give you two modern-day politicians, Pete Buttigieg and Gavin Newsom. Okay. Pete Buttigieg, just a couple weeks ago, he was asked his opinion when it comes to trans people participating in sports. I want you to read Buttigieg's quote up here of his opinion of it. What are some things you can pick out? What is he saying here?
It should not be a political issue.
What does he want to do?
Basically wants to ignore it.
We're just going to ignore it, okay? And that's why you've also seen this.
I don't know where I agree with that.
For Buttigieg, what has he taken out, and his husband have taken out of their Twitter profiles that used to be there, and now they're magically gone? Got rid of their pronouns. Do you know why Buttigieg is doing these things? Yes, because he's probably plotting a run for president. Yeah, and he wants to appeal to people in the middle, ultimately.
So are you saying he shouldn't be doing this as a strategy?
I don't think so. I don't think this is a winning strategy if you're looking at it just politically. But beyond that, does this show moral courage?
No.
No, and that's my issue with it, beyond political strategy. This shows you if he's willing to capitulate on this, what else is he willing to capitulate on? Anything. If he's not going to protect somebody, the most oppressed group possible, like a young trans person that's trying to play a sport, do you think he's going to protect like your health care, your social security at the end of the day? Probably not. Okay, and then Gavin Newsom, he was actually just on Charlie Kirk's podcast a couple weeks ago. He was asked about the trans rights issue when it comes to sports once again. What is Gavin Newsom saying?
He wants to force the dogs.
That's exactly what he's saying. Okay, and that's why it's important, even if you might like or you think you like some of these politicians, do you have to hold these people accountable? No doubt. Okay, otherwise you're just ignoring issues that really do require a lot of moral courage. That's why I love MLK's quote up here, but what does he argue? It's a simple quote, but I think it's powerful.
Just do the right thing.
Just do, even if it's not popular, should you do the morally correct thing? Yes. Okay, and that takes a lot of courage to actually do. All right, Kinsey I already mentioned for his studies, but his studies were groundbreaking, going back to some of the historical elements of this. But he published some groundbreaking studies in 1948 and 1953, and those are the titles up there, so sexual behavior in the human male and in the human female. And what he came up with, which is pretty fascinating, was like a scale of heterosexuality, homosexuality, and different variations kind of in between, ultimately. So he kind of broke ground when it came to actually studying the gay community and figuring this stuff out. And what he came away with was that 37% of males rank at least like a 3 when it comes to their sexual orientation for the most part. And he said about 10% of the entire population would be somewhere in the middle of the scale ultimately. So it really broke a lot of like misconceptions that people had in their head when it came to gay rights groups. So his studies were legendary. They were groundbreaking. So that's Kinsey. But let's flash forward to something that, again, I don't think is super well known. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the Cold War, okay? So if you don't know, I'll give you a quick breakdown of the Cold War itself. But when this issue developed between the United States and the Soviet Union, basically between capitalism and communism, that was really at the heart of the clash up here. The Soviet Union made massive gains when it came to income inequality. Look very closely at this graph. This shows you the wealth of the top 10%, the richest of the rich. What percentage of all the wealth in the country does the top 10% control? The blue line is Russia, the Soviet Union. Before the communist revolution, what percentage of the wealth did the richest of the rich control? Almost half of it. The revolution took place in 1917. What do you notice right out of the gates? It dropped how much? Way down. And was their wealth gap pretty small compared to the United States and even France during the time period? Okay? Obviously. How do you think the ruling class is going to respond to the success of Lenin's communist revolution inside of the Soviet Union in the United States? Demonize it. Okay, so I mean, obviously the rich absolutely hate communism. That's why you saw the Red Scare develop as, oh, communism's the worst thing in the history of the world. They're going to come to kill you. I guess if communism runs wild here, then your poor white young girl is going to have to make out with an African American man, and I guess the Jewish symbol has something to do with it as well. So all these just horrific scare tactics were utilized during the Red Scare. And then to take it up a notch, people actually protesting outside the White House, race mixing is what? God forbid, so this sort of stuff. Now, I hope somebody can pinpoint it, but if you were to pick one politician, who was really at the heart of the Red Scare? Joseph McCarthy, the Republican senator from Wisconsin. So maybe you're familiar with McCarthyism, but he was the guy that really spearheaded the Red Scare in particular. And these are just some of his quotes, but our job as Americans is to dislodge the traitors, find them everywhere. If there's a secret communist, rat them out. We got to get these people out of this country. But I'll take it up again, one more notch. Is anybody familiar with this aspect of the Cold War called the Lavender Scare? Okay, I'm glad that some of you at least heard of it. It's not a super well known, it's an offshoot of the Cold War, but it's something that requires, I think, a decent amount of attention. I had to censor this because it's a rough quote. This is McCarthy. Take a look at his quote up here. It gets right to the heart of what this guy's all about. Does that tell you everything you need to know about Joseph McCarthy? There you go. All right, so the Lavender Scare was about not just outing communists, but like gay communists in particular, and definitely just targeting gay people in general on any member of the LGBTQ community. So that's where these public hearings took place to try to shame people into resignations or trying to out their friends if they were, secret communists or if they were gay. The Truman administration spearheaded this as well. So take a second and scan through this quote. This was a memo from the Truman administration in 1950. But what are they arguing here? Why do we have to go over homosexuals in the eyes of the federal government?
They're susceptible.
Exactly.
Subversion.
Exactly. They'll sell us out the second that they get to the Soviets, so we can't allow them to work inside of the federal government. One key note up here, this has caused a breach of security. We have no evidence that they've actually done this. We just think this. So let's try to get rid of them. Do you know how many gay people were ultimately ousted by the end of the Lavender Scare? They had government jobs, they were kicked out or forced to resign in silence. 5,000 by the end. Okay, so it's significant. So you can see like different headlines, those numbers continuing to add up little by little. And then do you know which president eventually officially signed an executive order to ban homosexuals from government employment just straight up? It was Eisenhower. Yep. So 1953, Dwight Eisenhower signs Executive Order 10450, which basically just says anybody that fits this criteria, which is, I mean, he's trying to do it under the radar, but is he targeting gay people with this? Clearly, okay? And that's how he was ultimately able to oust a whole bunch of gay individuals who used to have government jobs. They were kicked right out. Now, as sad and like upsetting and I'm sure infuriating as this time period is, can you think of any silver lining to this, of this level of government repression with the Lavender Scare in particular? Is there anything good that could come out of it? Yeah. What did like a lot of gay groups finally start to realize, I guess, by the end of the Lavender Scare? We got to unite. We got to fight back. Okay, so really this is the beginnings of the gay rights movement. So you start to see more organization realizing the government is seriously oppressing us. We got to do something significant about it. And I'll highlight a couple groups that really start that process. They kind of build on the Society for Human Rights that I mentioned earlier. One of the first ones was the Mattachine Society in the 1950s, who were founded on communist principles. You can go down their platform. It's 4 different points up there, but it's pretty simple once again. Unify homosexuals who are isolated, educated people, find individuals who could provide leadership, and assist gay people who are going through repression. So that's what their platform was about. You know, unity, solidarity, those sorts of things, and trying to help out the oppressed. I just like this because I'm a history dork, but their name was based off an old French Renaissance group that used to meet of unmarried men who used to get together during the French Renaissance and mock the French monarchy. And they used to wear these masks, so that's where they got the name from, was from the Mattachine. But that's why they named themselves that. So that's interesting, well, to me. But yeah, they had literature that they published. They also worked with another group, which is very not well known at all. One of the first lesbian organizations was the Daughters of Bilitis, and the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis worked together quite frequently, and they actually did one of the most symbolic protests in the 1960s that, sadly, I think gets ignored. They picketed the White House together in 1965, asking for an end to that federal ban on gay people being allowed to work inside of the federal government. And you notice different groups of people, that true vision of solidarity that we talked about showing up there. And then another one of their most significant protests, I just like the name of this. It was called the Julius Sip-In of 1966, and this was in New York City. Take a guess, and this was a state liquor law that was on the books even in New York City in the 60s. What could bars do with gay patrons whenever they wanted? They could deny them service. So what the Mattachine Society did, we're going to go from bar to bar. What did they actually want to have happen? They want it to be denied, because what are they trying to do? That's it. Okay, they wanted to trigger like a lawsuit basically and try to get this in front of the courts and challenge these, super oppressive laws that were on the books. Dick Leish was the one who kind of led the Julius Sip-In, so I just want to highlight him. Can you find any historic parallels between what the Mattachine Society is doing here and another example in history? Exactly. It's just like the sit-ins that you saw down in the South. Same sort of setup here. And if you can take a second to think about this, why, when you're performing civil disobedience, you're knowingly breaking a law, why do you want to be punished for your crime? What are you trying to show? Show systems of oppression. What are you trying to demonstrate about the law itself? It's immoral. It's stupid. Okay, I'm going to be beat up or punished or thrown in jail for getting a drink at a bar? Like, you're trying to wake people up, to that injustice ultimately. So they went to 3 different bars. They did get arrested. And they actually got their case in front of the New York City Commission of Human Rights, and thankfully, they ruled that the state liquor authority, their laws that were on the books, were discriminatory. Okay, so they actually won So this was a huge early win in the 1960s for the gay rights movement. But it wasn't all good. This is a tougher question, but what impact do you think that Julia Sippin's success had on the gay community? What did some like gay people think as, oh, we won, now what?
I think there were a lot of people that didn't really want to go through the effort of revolution. It was more about just staying under the radar and keeping status quo because they had a lot of beliefs and they didn't want to be part of that.
Absolutely, you certainly see that.
Also forced the gay community into the bars on by the mafia.
Definitely, we'll get to that in a second. Yep. Because it basically created like a false sense of security. Because some of like the raids on gay bars started to die down after they won this. So people started going to gay bars a little bit more so. And then we'll get to Stonewall in a second. But it kind of, like I said, it created that false sense of security. One more example though before we get to the major one of Stonewall, which is much more well known. The Compton cafeteria riots in San Francisco in 1966. This is Gene Compton's cafeteria. It was a diner. It was a 24-hour diner. And it was the only like actual safe space for trans people inside of San Francisco in the 1960s. So they would frequently gather here. Unfortunately though, what do you think the police did to this place en masse? Constantly raided it because there was anti-cross-dressing laws that were on the books even in San Francisco in the 1960s. During one of these raids, they decided to arrest a trans person. They had the trans person handcuffed, bringing them out to the car. Guess what the entire community decided to do? They didn't just block that, they took it up a notch. What's up?
I think they burned the car.
They did. They burnt the police car down. They threw dishes. They threw chairs. They lit a newsstand on fire. They just decided enough's enough. And they, just basically took to the streets. So there's a few pictures of the Compton cafeteria riots. There is a memorial outside, and even in San Francisco today, they made a play that recreates the Compton cafeteria riots, which I think is pretty cool. But Amanda St. James was one of the few people that actually witnessed what took place there. And if you can quickly read through the quote, what did they ultimately decide? They're tired of enough's enough. We got to do something significant. And it led to major changes. Take a look at this list up here. But after those riots, what were some really positive reforms that came out of this violent act of rioting against the police and this organization as a whole?
Some recognition of the
Definitely that. What else did they get for people's like material needs? Job funding, funding for school. They actually got like significant wins up here. So this was huge. So I guess the big question that I'm asking you, what's the historical lesson to take away from the Compton cafeteria riots? Fight for your rights, and sometimes that's what gets the goods. Okay, and I'll give you a quote here from Frantz Fanon, one of my favorite political philosophers ultimately, but
It's a shock to the system. It makes you realize that you have to live within the oppressive system.
exactly. Does it kind of wake you up to you? Are you reconnecting with your humanity in a way? Yeah, and that's what Fanon's arguing. As long as it's like intelligently directed, it can have positive effects, and you see that all throughout history. All right, then we get to Stonewall. If you're not familiar with the Stonewall riot of 1969, I have a brief, just 3-minute video clip that sums it up. Would you like me to play that?
Yeah.
Is that all right? Okay, so I'll play this for you. It does a good job of summarizing it. Then we'll talk about the major effects on the other end. So check this out. Is that coming through or not? Okay. Might have disconnected from that. All right. Is it, if you're not familiar, is everybody somewhat familiar with Stonewall?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody want to try to summarize it? You can look up here. I have a deep breakdown of exactly what happened, but if anybody is familiar, you can go for it of what happened during the Stonewall riots. But yeah.
there was a group that is created and started, which was the first break, but a group of trans people that got sick of being raped, and so fought back against the police.
That's it. It's kind of like what happened at Compton Cafeteria, only like next level, because there was more people at the Stonewall Inn. Eventually, there was a crowd of almost like 500 people that ultimately amassed.
And the Stonewall Bar was owned by the mafia.
It it was owned by the mafia, and they would use that to extort some of the more wealthier patrons in particular. Absolutely. So for Stonewall, I'll show you a couple pictures of what ultimately ended up happening here, but the way that the media framed this is disgusting. So you can take a look at some of the headlines during the time period. So that's how people were characterized for standing up for their rights and fighting back. And I love MLK's quote because I think it ties directly into what happened at Stonewall. Like people that wanted to complain about the riots. What is he arguing here?
They weren't being heard.
We got to do something, okay? And that's what a riot is. It's a language of the unheard. Eventually this comes out in violent ways if you're not going to pay attention to these people. Now, I'm curious to get people's thoughts on this. The Mattachine Society was still around when the Stonewall riots took place in 1969. Read their graffiti, though, that they put up, because the Stonewall riots lasted 6 days, which not a lot of people remember. It was an ongoing event. How did the Mattachine Society respond, that early gay rights group that I highlighted a few minutes ago? What is their message up here? They were condemning the violence. How do you think some members of the gay community started to feel towards the Mattachine Society during this time period? Resentful, and be like, you're not really with us at the end of the day. And if you want a historical parallel, you go back to the African American civil rights movement. It's how some people, especially the younger generation of African Americans, were like, MLK's methods aren't really working. We got to look to the Black Panthers. We got to look to Malcolm X. They're doing things that we feel are more significant in our eyes. And that's where you get the creation of one of the most significant gay rights groups, the Gay Liberation Front, forms out of the wake of the Stonewall riots. And the Gay Liberation Front was unapologetic. They're not going to be like the Mattachine Society. They're going to fight back and stand up for people's rights, and you can see it in just the way that they were marching, the things that they fought for. But a couple people that I want to highlight that sadly have been lost throughout history were a couple individuals that are at the forefront of the Gay Liberation Front, were at the Stonewall riots, formed their own organization eventually, which I'll show you in a second, but really impressive person, Marsha P. Johnson. Okay, and if you're not familiar with Marsha P. Johnson, take a look at this quote up here. Does this say it all? What was Marsha P. Johnson all about? Liberating everyone, okay? And then one other person that I want to highlight, Sylvia Rivera. Love this quote as well. How did she respond when she saw a Molotov cocktail? Yes, this is exactly what I've been waiting for. All right, the gloves are finally off. So some fantastic quotes. And then what both Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera started, this was an offshoot of the Gay Liberation Front. They started STAR, which was the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which also did significant protests and utilized some of those methods. So I think that's pretty interesting. This, I would love somebody to take a guess on. There was another famous civil rights group that eventually allied with STAR, with the Gay Liberation Front. Do you know who kind of started to see these connections between oppressed people and did form a coalition with them starting in 1970, which was significant? I'll give you a hint. It's one that I just mentioned like 60 seconds ago, the Black Panther Party. Okay, so the Black Panthers, I hope everybody's at least somewhat familiar with Huey Newton, one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party. In 1970, he gave a speech, and it's a great speech. It's fairly short, but I'll just give you a couple excerpts from it. Do you get what he's arguing up here?
Become even stronger when you unify these disparate groups of oppressed people.
Very good. And do you know why this was difficult for Huey Newton to do? This is sad, but it's true. And you got to confront this stuff.
Because he didn't like the neighbors.
Yeah, he had his own personal issues with it, and unfortunately, within like certain semblance of the African American community, they were very much opposed to what the gay rights movement was doing. But I love what he says up here. We must gain security in ourselves and have respect for all people. We got to get over ourselves. It's basically what he's saying. Get over your prejudices, because if you don't, who's that playing into the hands of once again? The upper class. So that's it. So it was very brave for him to give that speech. And also kind of follows suit with like the things that Fred Hampton believed, who's one of my favorite people in history, who was one of the leaders of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. He's the one that started the Rainbow Coalition, uniting all these different oppressed groups across Chicago. Sadly, do you know what happened to Fred Hampton for putting together the Rainbow Coalition? Who assassinated him? The FBI. In one of the most horrific assassinations you will ever hear of in history. He was shot like 99 times by the Chicago PD on behalf of the FBI. Okay. Yes, his pregnant fiance, he was in bed with. The FBI informant that sold out the Black Panthers in Fred Hampton the night before gave him a roofie so he slept through the raid and was shot in his sleep at point blank range multiple times to make sure that he died while his fiancee was right outside the door listening to this, execution take place. But I guess the bigger picture question is this. Do you understand why Fred Hampton, Huey Newton, the Black Panther Party, why were they systematically destroyed by the U.S. government?
Being successful.
They presented a legitimate threat.
That's it. They were a legitimate threat to capital, and they were not going to let that stick around. All right, next example. AIDS crisis. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan, this is nuts. The AIDS epidemic started in 1981. How long did it take him to even just mention the word HIV or AIDS in a speech? It took him 6 years to even mention it, and people were dying en masse during this time period. And people were protesting in the streets saying like, hey, can you direct some federal funds towards AIDS research and maybe you can save a couple of our lives? What was Reagan's response to that? Dead silence. And that's why I love some of the signs that especially gay rights group is trying to parade around with. Your silence actually equals what? It's death. Like, you are killing us by not taking action on this. So if you do the math and you look up the statistics, almost 90,000 people probably perished as a result of Reagan not doing anything around this. I love this person's jacket. If I die of AIDS, where should you put my body? The steps of the FDA, because they're placing the blame directly where? The federal government's fault. They're not protecting us, and that's where you should put my body at the end of the day. And there was like researchers that were trying to push the Reagan administration to take this seriously. This is Dr. Conant. He wrote to Ronald Reagan and said, hey, this is a serious issue. Can you please direct the FDA to like do something about this? Here was Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan's response to Dr. Conant's letter. This is the only thing that Ronald Reagan and his wife sent back. What did they say? Thanks a lot. Thank you so much for your support. That was it. Well, since the video is not working, I can't play this clip for you, but it'll really just piss you off ultimately more than anything else. But there was one actually brave reporter in the press pool during the 1980s who was Lester Kinsolving, who was a super right-wing conservative journalist, but he at least had the guts to like question the Reagan administration on their silence when it came to the AIDS crisis. Do you know how he was, like what the response was from the press secretary and the Reagan administration? Just saying like, hey, can you do something about this? They mocked him to the nth degree. They started calling him gay like in front of everybody else and just trying to shame him into silence and just showing like the horrific attitudes people had in the 1980s towards just the gay community in general. There's again, I won't play this because you won't be able to hear it, but it's from this short film from 2015 called When AIDS Was Funny, when like people were mocked for this stuff. It's really sickening and disgusting, but it gives you a good insight into what the Reagan administration was all about. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Eventually in 1990, the Ryan White Care Act was passed, which is where you get the red ribbon, which you still see today. But Ryan White was a 13-year-old in Indiana who got AIDS from a blood transfusion and then got expelled from school because he had HIV. Okay, and then he passed away at the age of 18, which is incredibly sad to think about. But because of his story and what ultimately ended up happening is they started to direct some federal funds towards AZT, the like drug that actually can treat HIV, and that law is still on the books today. So that's why there is federal funding for it. But it was Reagan's silence, and then this tons of people having to pass away to finally spark the government to do something about it, which is very frustrating. All right, last few things, and we'll take a break. I kind of just briefly summarized the 90s and the 2000s for you, just highlight a couple important events. The Clinton administration. If you think of Bill Clinton and gay rights, or just the gay population in general, what's maybe something that pops into your head? No, he did not. Don't Ask, Don't Tell comes out during his time period, so you get that. I'm doing the direct opposite.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. And then also during the Clinton administration, Colorado passed this horrific amendment to their state constitution called Amendment 2 that basically was going to allow for open job discrimination against the gay community. Like, you would have the right to deny somebody a job because they were gay, okay? This case ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and it's Romer versus Evans in 1996. Thankfully, the Supreme Court decided, hey, that Colorado amendment, that is super unconstitutional. We're not gonna allow that to stand. And it was a 6-3 decision. for the Supreme Court. And you can see which way each justice voted, which is not surprising if you know the backstory of any of these justices. But that was thankfully a positive Supreme Court case in the 90s to push back against these discriminatory policies that were on the books. But then to make things worse, you flash forward about a year later, Bill Clinton signed an act that is pretty disgusting when you look back on this. Is anybody familiar with the Defense of Marriage Act? What do you think the Defense of Marriage Act outlined? What is marriage in the eyes of the federal government? One man and one woman. I want you to read Clinton's quote up here after he signed the Defense of Marriage Act into law. Why is this pathetic? How does he phrase it at the beginning, though? I don't like discrimination, but let me sign this discriminatory law. So, yeah, it's totally cool. And it wasn't even close, because this had to pass the House and the Senate. It was 342 to 67 when it came to passing the Defense of Marriage Act. I'll give Bernie Sanders credit. He actually voted no when he was in the House against it, so he was one of the few. And then in the Senate, it was 85 to 14, so not even close. So it passed very easily. And the problem with this, what this did was it pushed it back to the states. Okay, now the states get to decide what marriage is at the end of the day. And this happens all throughout US history. What happens when an issue is pushed back to the states? When you're talking about somebody's rights, you push it back to the states. Definitely. Can you guys think of a sad modern day example of now, this used to be federally protected, now it's been pushed back to the states, and now it sucks for a lot of people? You got it. When Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, you used to have these federal protections. Now if you live in a state that still has protections, like New York, you're protected, you're okay. Can you give me a couple states that are going to throw people to the wolves when it comes to abortion rights? Yeah, throw a dart on the map in the South, you're going to hit the mark. Okay, so for Roe v. Wade, I don't know if you're familiar with some of these laws, but now that it's been pushed back to the states, that's Arkansas' state law on abortion, that's Texas's state law on abortion. Read through those, it is nuts. Are those insane punishments? Yeah, again, that's what happens when you preach states' rights. It gives the state the right to do what? Screw everybody over, yeah, discriminate against you. Now, one silver lining in this, do you know which civil rights icon jumped into the fray and actually started to support the gay rights movement in 1998 because she saw how disgusting the Defense of Marriage Act was, she saw what was happening here and decided, I gotta jump into this fight and support the gay community? I'll give you a hint. It's a spouse.
Hillary Clinton?
No. No. Coretta Scott King, MLK's wife, okay? And she faced a lot of backlash, again, from some segments of the African-American community for jumping into the fight. But she quotes her husband up here who says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Again, preaching those concepts of true solidarity. So she decided to get interested in this fight. So, good for her looking back on it. One other quick example of this, the Pink Panther Patrol in the 1990s in New York City. This was a time when, again, polices were raiding gay bars en masse. The Pink Panther Patrol formed just kind of, out of nothing. Why do you think they put together this organization? Community defense. It was like the Black Panthers, how they would go around and patrol and make sure that African Americans were protected. That's what the Pink Panther Patrol did inside of New York City. You can see some of the literature and the way that they were framed in the media during the time period. Do you know what happened to the Pink Panther Patrol? And this sucks. Do you know why they stopped existing after a while?
They labeled as a terrorist group?
No, it's actually almost more nefarious than that.
They were subverted.
They were sued into oblivion. By what? Yes. They were sued by MGM into oblivion because MGM, you're using our trademark, you can't do that. And which way do you think the courts decided? The courts backed MGM because they could obviously fund it. So that's why the Pink Panther Patrol just went out the window. But it tells you a lot when you really break that down. All right, real quick, a few more things. George W. Bush administration. Bush obviously was no fan of the gay community whatsoever. But during his administration, when you get the Lawrence versus Texas Supreme Court ruling in 2003, finally those sodomy laws were ruled unconstitutional. And it was a 6-3 decision. Again, you notice which justices voted which way. It's not surprising. Once again, George Bush never commented on the Lawrence versus Texas case, but he did have another comment shortly after, because do you think he liked the Supreme Court ruling up here? No. So read his quote. Like, hey, what do we got to do here, folks? We got to put that into the actual Constitution, all right? Now, one person that I do want to throw under the bus just real quick. Do you know which person is still, I think, slightly popular inside of the gay community that is a big fan and super close friends with George W. Bush? Ellen DeGeneres, okay? Do you understand why I'm showing you this? It's class, so yes, very good.
It's also one of the most palatable gays ever. for mainstream people, so.
No doubt, no doubt. All right, the Obama administration. If you attended any of my previous ones, I have a lot of issues with the Obama administration when it comes to economic policy. But in terms of some social policy, you got to give him credit for a few things in particular. He did repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He was the president during Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage inside of the United States. Do you know what the decision was for Obergefell v. Hodges? So 9 justices on the Supreme Court. How close was it? It was 5-4. Okay, so it was a very close decision. You can see the way that the votes went down. And it was actually Anthony Kennedy, a Republican, who was the swing vote that got same-sex marriage to ultimately be legalized. And then you see this all throughout history, but support for gay marriage, rapid improvements of that dating back to where it started to today. But the key point that I want to make is this. Was it Barack Obama who won marriage equality for the gay community, or was it the culmination of all the groups that I've highlighted so far during this presentation?
Obama just had the same power at the same time.
Exactly. Like, history, again, is built on working class movements and those changes. But yeah.
I'd argue it wasn't even Obama. I think it was Joe Biden. Joe Biden was the one who said it in an interview that he supports gay marriage.
And that's what kind of sparked this?
Of course, Obama said Obama.
Yeah, because Obama, like, early on was not a fan of those rights whatsoever. So, but if you put pressure on politicians in the right ways, you can get them to ultimately side with you. So.
He's going to take credit for sure.
Oh, no doubt. He'll definitely capitalize on that. So just remember this. That's one of the biggest things that I want to stress. That's what changes history, is working class people coming together and fighting for those rights in solidarity. All right, I hope that you will stick around. I'm going to take a 10-minute break. The PSL is going to give a really quick kind of talk for you. And then what I want to cover is the modern day issues, which I think is really important to connect the dots on all this. So I hope you stick around, but yeah, Steph, go ahead. All right, thanks a lot for sticking around, everyone. Let's go through some modern day issues. So I'm going to start, I kind of break it down into different segments. So we're going to take a look at economic issues surrounding the LGBTQ plus community first. I love this graphic that somebody made. What's the real problem here? Yeah, that's it. It's not trans youth. And if you look at the wealth gap across the United States is obviously gigantic. It's a massive issue. If you're a member of the working class in general, what do you think that wealth gap looks like if you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community? It's even worse. Okay, so you break it down by various groups within the community. You can see the numbers are pretty staggering. And I guess to summarize it just a little bit more so, LGBTQ plus workers earn about 90 cents for every dollar a typical worker makes. And then if you break it down just by trans people in particular, the statistics are alarming. So if you go all the way down to the bottom, trans women in particular make just 60% of what the average worker makes. Why do you think this isn't discussed all that much?
Because they don't tell the status quo.
It does. It keeps everything the way that it is, divide up the working class. It's the same story over and over again. But it gets worse once you really start to dig into it. This is something, until I started doing research for this presentation, I was not aware of myself, but there are over 35 states that have no LGBTQ plus like credit protections in place, which means you can technically be denied a line of credit or a mortgage for being gay, okay? So they will never openly say that, a bank, but does it give them the leeway to deny you for another reason? For sure. So if you look at the statistics, 73% of the time, LGBTQ plus people were denied more often for a mortgage. They overpay on their mortgages typically as well. They get exploited and taken advantage of. They receive higher fees on their banks, like statements and bank accounts. So all those issues are massive economic issues that definitely are ignored and need to be addressed much more so. And then in terms of social issues, these are depressing statistics, but again, I think it's important to pick out. Violent victim rates are off the charts for the LGBTQ plus community compared to the cisgender community, and especially for trans people in particular. Those are double, and then some, when you're looking at just violent victimization.
It's even worse for black trans women.
Devin, perfect segue. 63% of victims of fatal violence are black transgender women. I think most of you know this anyway, but if somebody can verbalize it, why are these rates so high for these groups in particular? Exactly. Okay, and they sadly the easiest to take advantage of and exploit. Yeah, so that's why I think you see those stats. And then break it down in terms of domestic violence rates and then actual abuse rates of what specific types of abuse the LGBTQ community has to deal with. The number one type of abuse is emotional abuse, and then you get to actual physical abuse, but even sadder, you have emotional and physical abuse at about 20% of the time. So again, those statistics are alarming and very sad, and something that obviously needs to be addressed. Again, I don't want to make this completely dark, but you'll probably see where I'm going with this. Suicide rates are also alarmingly high. And this study that I found in particular, this is of the youth community, okay? And what you're seeing up here, the light yellow is just people that have considered suicide. I mean, that's really scary stuff to take a look at. And then the darker orange is actual attempted suicides, which again, much higher than anybody in the cis community.
It's even higher for the transgender veterans, it's close to 50%.
Absolutely. Yep. You can certainly see that as well. So that's why, when you look closely at a study like this, what spaces do LGBTQ plus people actually turn to try to find community, to find some semblance of, coming together with other people? You notice it's online. That's where you see a lot of that work developing. But the other one that is incredibly high up there is school. That's why school is so important for a lot of students in particular. It provides you that safe space, a person that you can go to, a person that you can trust. And sadly, myself included, there's others of us here. How are some teachers being treated for providing that safe space for people? For sure. And what's the reason behind that? Why are they trying to frame people like us in that sort of capacity?
Because they don't want to blame themselves.
Yes, very good. Okay, and that's why GSA clubs are so helpful inside of schools, and that's why they're being targeted and sometimes shut down, even in our state in particular. And then beyond that, this is a point that my wife raised, which I wasn't even thinking, which is, I think, an excellent point. You take a look at something like this. These augmentative surgeries, are these viewed as a form of mutilation, or are they viewed as a form of self-care and self-love? Self-care and self-love. When a trans person goes through an augmentative surgery, how is it viewed? You're mutilating your body. Okay, so pushing back against stuff like that, I think, is critical and really important. All right, one of the other big things that I want to tackle, which I already mentioned, but LGBTQ plus community and sports, trans athletes. Why is it really important to not abandon this fight and push back against the nonsense that is being stressed when it comes to why trans individuals should not be allowed to participate in women's sports in particular?
It's really a wedge issue.
It's definitely a wedge
It's the way
issue.
to get us out of the public eye.
You got it. And going back to that quote, let me ask you guys this. Do you think it's popular right now to support trans youth participating in women's sports? No. Do you know what the stats say? What percentage of the American public is actually on board with that right now? Now, it's higher than you might think, but it's still not a majority, I'll tell you that. It's about 40% according to the latest study that I found, okay? But the reason why I'm showing you MLK, and this is, again, something that a lot of people have forgotten. Was MLK popular during his time, or was he vilified during his time? He was vilified, which people forget now because we have Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and he was like this wonderful icon that everybody must have loved and respected back in the 1960s. Hell no. You look at the polls for what MLK was doing, the vast majority of people were seriously opposed to even just his methods of civil disobedience back during this time period. But what did he do? He kept doing it anyway. Why?
Because he was the right thing
it's the right thing to do. Okay, and you have to have moral courage in order to do that. So you look at all these different polls for MLK's time period. Even his proposed mass rally, the March on Washington, 60% of the public said, I don't like this. Okay, for giving a speech in the nation's capital. And then even worse, when he was assassinated, this is disgusting, but what did 31% of the American public think when MLK was shot? He deserved it. Okay, but he had the moral courage to actually stand up to that. And that's why you look at the trans youth, in sports issue in particular, it's being kicked back to the states right now. And like I already said, what always happens when issues like this are kicked back to the states, what's going to happen? Yeah, mass bans, and maybe if you live in a progressive state, you might have some protections, but those protections can be eroded. Even in our state, it's on a school-by-school decision. Okay, you don't have universal protections when it comes to that stuff. And to make things worse, I don't want to abandon the sports space, because I think is actually a very important space to get involved in and try to push back against some of the disgusting behavior that I'm seeing inside of the sports community lately. Because I am a huge sports fan, but I see a lot of troubling stuff happening inside of those areas in particular. And when you look at this is the gender divide when it comes to the ideological gap. Women are trending much more in the liberal direction, or the socialist and communist direction. Most men inside of this country, though, are doing what instead? Trending much more conservative, all the way towards fascism. Definitely. But that's what I'm seeing, like, even, I'm a big New York Yankee fan. Some of the things that happens inside Yankee Stadium now are absolutely disgusting to me, but this is basically what sports culture has become, just like idiot dude bros and the worst possible people that you could possibly imagine, which I think this guy exemplifies quite well up here. But that's why you can't cede this space. You have to push back against this, as difficult as it actually is. I think some of you are familiar with the woman on the right, Riley Gaines. Okay, if you're not, the person that you're seeing over there on the left is a trans woman, Leah Thomas. She's a fantastic swimmer. She tied for 5th place with Riley Gaines in the 200 meter freestyle at the 2022 National Championships. So they both tied for 5th place. And like I said, Leah Thomas is trans. Riley Gaines, initially, when they tied for 5th, what statement did Riley Gaines make up here? I support her transition. Look at what Leah Thomas is going through. I want to support her as best I can. Do you know what has happened to Riley Gaines today? What Riley Gaines goes around and preaches around the entire country? She sells this shirt now. She's a total grifter, exactly. Perfect term. Because she has this slogan now. This is the organization that she started. Our bodies, our sports.
And notice there was a man wearing a t-shirt in there.
Great point. Yes, very good. Can anybody take us? This is a little bit tougher, but why is this slogan actually kind of ridiculous when you break it down? But yeah.
It's co-opting incredibly important to women. It also affects women.
Our bodies ourselves that whole.
And she probably is against abortion because she's on the right. So like,
Absolutely.
what? I don't understand.
Guess who's a super huge fan of Riley Gaines? President Trump loves Riley Gaines. Okay, because what use is Riley Gaines? Why does Trump love her?
I'm sure she's
Full
blind
mouth
and blue-eyed.
free.
Yep. And if you're not familiar with the things that Riley Gaines and also Caitlyn Jenner does as well, goes around on Twitter just harassing trans youth and like encouraging other people to go out into these communities and berate them. There was a trans youth person that won homecoming queen, and Riley Gaines couldn't handle that and tried to organize her mass movement. She does have a lot of followers to harass this person inside of her small town.
Literally a child.
An actual child. Okay, and Caitlyn Jenner, exact same thing.
Where are people backing her with money?
That's a great question, but like the Heritage Foundation, some of those big conservative groups, they fund people like that to the max. They're useful to capital. That's always what it comes back to. I found this. I can share this if anybody's interested. But this was phenomenal. What I found. These are all the arguments that people always use of why trans youth should not be allowed to participate in women's sports, or just be allowed to participate in sports in general. I want to highlight a couple of these because they do a great job giving actual research and studies that pushes back against each argument. That can give you kind of some material that you might need to push back inside of your own communities. So we'll start with this one. Trans women have a biological advantage in women's sports regardless of any other factors. I want you to read this. What is the difference between Caster Semenya and Michael Phelps. When it comes to that argument of just some trans women, they have biological advantage, you can't allow them to compete.
I think they have the same testosterone levels.
Michael Phelps has, normally more policeman than that advantage that's made him one of the best athletes.
Does anybody whine and complain about Michael Phelps' supposed advantages? Does everybody freak out, though, about Caster Semenya? So what's the difference? That's it. Okay? So I'll give you a great example. I'm a guy. Do I feel bad or like feel inferior to Aaron Judge? He's a guy as well. What should happen here?
Yeah.
Are we on the same level playing field? Guys, is sports just about some people that have natural talent and can best you in that? Yeah, deal with it. Okay? That's part of the game. I'm not going to bitch and complain because Aaron Judge can hit a ball a lot farther than I possibly can. So again, I think that's a good way to push back against that. The other stuff that you see, trans women overwhelmingly dominate elite level women's sports, that's not true at all. Okay? There's been basically no trans people that have won like an Olympic medal or anything like that. The stats just don't back that up. This is another ridiculous argument, but excluding trans women will protect women's sports. Can you break down why that's ridiculous?
The percentages of trans women in sports is very low.
They're minuscule. And if you were to create like a special just trans sports league, okay, and you had to fund that league, where's the money going to come from? Is it going to come from the boys' sports program, or is it probably going to come from the women's sports program? No doubt, okay? And the arts funding, yes, and all these other important things. Yep, definitely the arts funding. Yeah, we still have arts class sometimes. Yeah, you can make that work, right? Yeah, she doesn't even have her supplies yet as an art teacher, so. But yeah, and then this: men will pretend to be trans women in order to dominate women's sports. This is such a fallacy that this is disgusting. And when this movie came out, I almost had an aneurysm. Ben Shapiro funded a movie called Lady Ballers, where he manufactured this narrative of these guys dressing up as women in order to dominate a women's sports league, saying that this is what's happening across the country. And the point that I'm trying to make is this: conservatives need to make garbage films to fit their fantasy narratives. But yeah.
He actually wanted to make a documentary, but could not find any examples of this happening in real life.
Very good. So he had to make one up. Yeah, he had to make up fiction in order for this to actually happen. So that's important. One other key thing, I can't stress this enough as well, the importance of ignoring celebrities. I'll give you one awful one, J.K. Rowling. Okay, so J.K. Rowling, do you know why why I'm highlighting her in particular? I feel like she is especially dangerous to like the trans liberation movement in particular, just the gay rights movement as a whole. Do you know why, in my eyes, she is so dangerous?
Because she has such an in with the youth.
Yes, definitely in with the youth, lots of money, well connected. And at least initially, more so now, it's just she makes it plain how much she hates trans people. But why was she definitely troubling very early on? Like, how did she try to present herself to the gay community? As an ally, as a fan. Remember, all of a sudden she made Dumbledore gay? So you saw that. But that's why I love this quote, once again, from Malcolm X. See how it relates to what I'm talking about with J.K. Rowling. Is she more subversive in some cases? Yeah, and if you're not familiar with the term, she's a TERF, okay, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, where she pretends to be a radical feminist except for trans people. She's not going to include them.
She's not even a feminist.
No, I would argue the feminist part, yeah, not even that. But that's how she phrases herself. And sadly, do you know which women's rights icons of the past actually share a lot of similarities with somebody like J.K. Rowling, that you could argue like delayed progress for women back in the day by making the same mistakes that J.K. Rowling is currently making? This is, again, what's up? Very good, yes. So this is stuff that, again, I wasn't taught in high school, and I wish that I was, but Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were not just a little bit racist, they were insanely racist. And I'll give you one quote from Susan B. Anthony. Is that about as bad as it gets? Okay, so that's Susan B. Anthony. They argued against the 15th Amendment being passed, like allowing African Americans the right to vote, because white women in their eyes we're smarter than them. Okay, we should be allowed to vote. So there's a ton of white supremacy within the early suffragette movement. And that's why I almost lost my mind when I saw this during the 2024 election. But you know, Susan B. Anthony, her grave's in Rochester because that's where she did a lot of her suffragette work. A lot of women place these like "I voted" stickers for Kamala Harris. When you actually know history, why is that kind of absurd? She'd be rolling in her grave, literally, probably right there, you know, during this time period. All the other suffragettes, though, as well, like after Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, here's Carrie Chapman Catt. She's saying women deserve the right to vote because what is it actually going to strengthen? White supremacy. Those are the arguments that they were making. And even during some of their marches, they asked black women to march in the back behind them because they did not want them to be at the forefront of the movement. And I guess the argument that I'm trying to make is this. Could the 19th Amendment maybe actually have been like, I don't know, the 16th Amendment if they actually showed solidarity with one another? Yeah, they delayed this. Quite possibly. Like they would have had a lot of gains a lot faster because they completely ignored people like Sojourner Truth, who had to start her own African American women's rights organization because the Elizabeth Cady Stantons of the world wanted nothing to do with her, and that delayed progress. So that's the argument that I'm making, is people like, you know, J.K. Rowling, they are huge impediments to the actual liberation movement, ultimately. So I guess the lessons to learn from this is what I just said. Like, you want to unite with everyone. Going back to Marsha P. Johnson's quote, you can't exclude people. Okay, they got to be a part of the movement, otherwise it's not going to work. All right, here's a different quote, and I think you'll understand what I'm trying to argue here, but when education is not liberating, what becomes the dream of the oppressed? You hope to one day become what? The oppressor instead of what? Truly free. I have one meme for you. Our boy, yeah, poor Yoshi up here. What's Yoshi's dream? One day I can do what? I can ride a horse, you know? I don't want to be free, I just want to become the oppressor. So, you know, the goal should be not assimilation, but true liberation, I guess is what I'm arguing. And then I have a video on this, but you know, it's not working, I don't have time to set it up, but do you know which nation, which government, show you a nice example here, is definitely leading the world in regards to LGBTQ rights and protections at the federal level? They just passed a family code 3 years ago that is very impressive, incredibly progressive. It's Cuba. Yeah, so actually inside of Cuba, their family code was voted on by over 6 million people that voted yes on this. I have the video up here, but like, you know, there's a lot of trans people inside of Cuba that were incredibly happy with what law was put on the books. Can you just take a second, because I really do want to highlight this. These are the 6 bullet points that I have of what was passed inside of Cuba, and just go down that list and you'll get what I'm trying to say up here, but these are very progressive, very much ahead of the game. Some really nice protections that honestly I wish we had here in this country. There's some really nice stuff up there, I guess is what I'm trying to show. Yeah, so that's quite nice. And they even just had, this was just a couple months ago, had a landmark approval of legal gender changes that makes it very easy for people to actually accomplish that with not a lot of red tape. Just makes it a seamless process for trans people inside of Cuba in particular. So you know, I think that's pretty impressive. And that's why I'll always go back to this quote, but like, if you guys know Cuban history, has Cuba gone through hell during its entire history at the behest of the US government making their life hell? Yeah. So with the poor of the earth, I place my luck. Do the oppressed get it? Yeah. Okay, and that's why I think you see these massive gains being made. And then other countries, you know, you're seeing a push towards this actually inside of China, of legalizing gay marriage, and also inside of India as well. And if you put those two nations together, that's almost 3 billion people on the planet that you actually have legal protections for. So I think things are trending in the right direction in other areas of the world, which is heartening to see. The last points that I want to make, just to summarize this, to end it, like I said, on a more positive note, you know, don't despair. Okay, there's obvious challenges and struggles, but when you start to actually organize and get politically active, you kind of lose that sense of fear that you have, it starts to actually get you more invested, and you just kind of come back to your humanity ultimately by getting involved in different sorts of political parties. So attend rallies, go to book studies, hold politicians accountable. And I can't stress this stuff enough, obviously, as a teacher, but study, read, support queer media, do those sorts of things to fight back against sometimes your own ignorance, and truly know your own history. And that's why I'll end with this quote from Howard Zinn. But I really would like you to take a second and read through this. I think this is beautiful. Did I show you a lot of sad and depressing stuff? Did I also show you incredible examples of people being brave in like the direct heart of oppression? Yeah, so what should you focus on ultimately? The latter. Focus on those people, because there's always people fighting back, there's always groups fighting back, and you can be that new generation that does that as well. So that's what Zinn's talking about. So like I said, organize, join a party, there's one right here. Attend rallies. That was one of the nice things that we saw in Utica a couple months back. Really good turnout for a LGBTQ plus rally, which was nice to see. Hold politicians accountable, even Democrats. If you like them, they can do better. Okay, so make sure that you always hold their feet to the fire. Support queer media. I don't know if anybody's ever seen I Saw the TV Glow. What an incredible movie. But if you want a good insight into the struggles of a trans person, made by an actual trans person, fantastic film. And then I can't stress this book enough. This is where I got a lot of my research and stuff from, was The Rainbow Ain't Never Been Enough, by a professor at the University of Louisville, who just kind of argues rainbow capitalism is not going to save you. So that gets into that. And then just to close with, unfortunately, does everybody remember the Pulse massacre, the Pulse shooting down in Florida? In the wake of that, what did the gay community do down in Florida, right outside the Pulse nightclub? They painted that sidewalk. DeSantis, the governor of Florida, what did he do with that sidewalk? And Trump encouraged him to do this as well. Spray paint over it. What are we seeing every single day, even though it is illegal to do this? They're chalking it anyway. Okay, why is that really nice? What is that showing? Solidarity, and who cares? Do it anyway. It's the right thing to do.
Nonviolence of disobedience.
Yeah, to push back against all that. So, all right, just lastly, if I can just say this, I just want to say thank you so much to Superofficial, Copper Easel, for PSL for being here. I hope you took something away from this. I'll leave my social medias up, and if anybody would, you don't have to do this at all. If you do want to donate anything to me, if you took something away from this, I would really appreciate it. It just helps me keep doing this more and more and getting out to more places and trying to reach more people. So if you would like to donate anything, I would greatly appreciate it. Or if you want to at least just join the social media platforms, you can stay up to date of where my next presentations are. That'd be really great as well. So if anybody wants to stick around, I do have discussion questions. If there's any questions that you have, I can try my best to answer, but I don't want to keep anybody because I said 7:30, I always end up going past. But I really appreciate it. So thanks a lot for sticking around, and I hope you took something away from this. So thank you so much. It was great. What's up? Okay, yeah, thanks.